The end of humanity is a gruesome thought. For 14 days in October, this end was a very real possibility in what was later to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the end of World War II, a new conflict arose, the Cold War, between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The US and USSR were fighting in a war of ideologies, the US on the side of democracy and USSR on the side of communism. This conflict spanned several decades, created many clashes in places like Berlin, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Cuba, and was plagued with a nuclear threat which was growing to be much worse than what had happened in Japan. However, it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis that this nuclear threat reached its zenith. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the result of the disputed rights of Cuba. Castro, in his idea of the right to a sovereign Cuba, caused a conflict between the responsibilities of Kennedy of the US and Khrushchev of the USSR. This was due to their conflicting perceptions of Cuba and their own role in its affairs. Cuba had always been striving for the right to be independent, but the US wanted Cuba to remain under its sphere of influence. In response, Castro looked to Khrushchev to help guarantee Cuba's freedom. Khrushchev took responsibility of protecting Cuba to maintain its prestige and gain second strike capabilities. This conflict would then erupt into the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All through the 1900s that Cuba felt that its sovereignty was impinged upon. Cubans think of the Cuban Revolution as something that was 100 years low.
Cuba had an interesting history with the U.S. The island nation began as a colony of Spain, but was liberated with the help of the U.S. in 1898 during the Spanish-American War and given full independence in 1902. Cuban sovereignty was an idea born out of the Cuba Libre movement of the war. The Cubans fought for the right to autonomy without Spanish rule, only to be governed by another imperial power, the U.S. America guaranteed that Cuba would not become part of the U.S. empire in the Teller Amendment. However, the Platt Amendment allowed the U.S. to have much more control on the ongoings of Cuba. The U.S. was exploiting Cuba for its own resources through neo-imperialism. The U.S. governed Cuba's trade, foreign policy, and economics for several years under the leadership of institutions like Fulgencio Batista's pro-American government. 85% of Cuban sugar, which was the main export of Cuba, went to the U.S. Cuba entered an era of prosperity, but with much more corruption and a massive wealth gap. In 1934, the American-Cuban Treaty of Relations repealed the Platt Amendment, giving more freedom to Cuba, lessening the responsibility of the U.S., and was a show of good relations between the countries. Then World War II happens. The outcome of the war put the U.S. and USSR as the two leading superpowers of the world. In the Cold War in the 1960s, the USSR was fighting a losing battle, for the U.S. had superior power, resources, and nuclear capabilities. The USSR was constantly under the threat of nuclear missiles. America possessed a serious nuclear advantage. Khrushchev knew this and needed a way to even the playing fields. This opportunity came in the form of Cuba. Fidel Castro rose to power and took over Cuba. He was strongly influenced by Marxist writings. Castro hated how the Batista government was so corrupt and blamed the U.S. for supporting it. With the help of guerrilla leader Che Guevara, Castro led the 26th of July movement to overthrow Batista during the Cuban Revolution, in an attempt to rid Cuba of U.S. imperialism and attain the right to Cuban sovereignty. He saw his revolution as the liberation from
the cruelest exploitation of the world by imperialism. Second Declaration of Havana, Fidel Castro, 1962.
Relations between the countries fell, and Castro's regime became the United Party of the Cuban Socialist Revolution.
In the Cold War, you were either with us or against us. There was no room for neutrals. To be non-aligned was to be with, actually, the Soviets.
The U.S. did not approve of Cuba becoming a foothold for the Soviets to enter into the Western Hemisphere. Geographically, Cuba was less than 100 miles off the shores of the U.S. and was surrounded by other Caribbean and South American nations. Domino theory foretold of the island nations of the Caribbean adopting anti-American ideas and governments. The Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary stated that the countries in Latin America were under the U.S. sphere of influence. This included Cuba. The U.S. did not suddenly drop its responsibilities as a power on the island with the rise of Castro. The U.S. embargoed Cuba, conducted the Bay of Pigs invasion, and later Operation Mongoose in an attempt to overthrow Castro. Castro felt threatened by the U.S. and asked its ally, the USSR, for help. Meanwhile, the Soviets and China were fighting for the responsibility to lead the non-aligned movement, which included the Third World countries during the Cold War. Khrushchev could not stand idly by and watch the U.S. take over Cuba. Losing an ally like that would inflict a serious prestige hit on the Soviets. This would show the world that the USSR is incapable of leading the Third World and the non-aligned movement. These political tensions would be the fuel for a much larger conflict. Castro came to the USSR in the search for an ally after its income was being shattered by the US embargo. Castro needed someone to back up Cuba's right to sovereignty against the US, while Khrushchev needed advantage in the Cold War. To counter the embargo, Khrushchev and Castro made a trade agreement that was Cuban sugar for Soviet oil. This kick-started their relationship, for Cubans started to become more dependent on Soviet markets and military aid, eventually leading to them becoming allies with the Soviet Union. Because of terrorist acts conducted within Cuba by Operation Mongoose, the Soviet Union felt the need to protect Cuba from the US invasion. Castro wanted to no longer be the lesser nation below an imperial power in his quest for true Cuban rights, but the US would not give up so easily.
This changed the strategic balance in the sense that the United States did before have the ability to strike first without being retaliated against. And so we lost that advantage. There was a military advantage that they provided. After all, these missiles had warheads that were the equivalent of 1 million tons of TNT.
As October 14th drew closer, every side of the arising conflict had their own goals. Castro wanted Cuba to maintain its right to be free of imperial rule. Khrushchev wanted to gain a foothold into the Western Hemisphere to put pressure on the U.S. and to defend his new ally Cuba. Kennedy did not want a Soviet foothold in the U.S. sphere of influence and sought to overthrow Castro. In order to uphold the responsibility to gain a strategic advantage and protect their new ally Cuba, Khrushchev decided to arrange Operation Nadir. This operation was a secret Soviet mission to establish a military presence in Cuba that involved nuclear missiles. The operation went forward in June 17, 1962, as Soviet freighters full of supplies left the Black Sea for Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially began on October 14th when U.S. U-2 reconnaissance planes finally discovered the missiles. Kennedy then assembled the first ex-con meetings, where they could think of a plan of action. They agreed the Soviet missiles installed in Cuba would undermine the U.S. responsibility of maintaining the sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere and protecting the American people. Having missiles in Cuba gave the Soviets quick nuclear strike capabilities throughout the continental U.S., including Washington, D.C. This put American citizens under the gun of nuclear missiles and gave Khrushchev immense bargaining power in any negotiations. Kennedy's advisors advocated for an invasion of Cuba, but not wanting to risk nuclear warfare, Kennedy decided instead on a blockade of Cuba to prevent more missiles from entering. He cleverly called the blockade a quarantine in his national address to the nation on October 22nd, since a blockade was considered an act of war. Khrushchev saw the U.S. blockade as an infringement on the rights of Cuba. In his letters to Kennedy, he claimed that Cuba had the right to defend themselves and to do as it pleased with its ally, the Soviet Union. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating during the crisis, both sides' military were squaring off in a peculiar duel, waiting for the other to shoot first. A U.S. U-2 plane was shot down, a Soviet submarine almost fired a nuclear torpedo after being hit with depth charges, and the U.S. blockade was being challenged by the Soviet Navy. The U.S. went to DEFCON 2, the lowest in history, which meant armed forces ready to deploy and engage in less than 6 hours, and bombers were ready to strike in 15 minutes. This was the closest the world came to nuclear war. Time was of the essence. Through several letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a compromise was finally made in which the Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba publicly, while the U.S. secretly removed their missiles from Turkey. Cuba was also guaranteed independence by the U.S., for they swore to no longer invade Cuba. Castro was never consulted in these negotiations, however. He felt like Cuba was used and its views didn't matter. Khrushchev, on the other hand, believed that he had fulfilled his responsibilities of protecting Cuba, but furthermore preventing a nuclear war. Kennedy had removed the threat of missiles from Cuba, fulfilling his responsibility to defend the U.S. from foreign threats. However, Cuba would now remain a free sovereign state, and the U.S. would be unable to overthrow Castro, failing the responsibility to maintain the U.S. sphere of influence. In the end, both sides won. Because there was no hellfire raining from the sky, buildings weren't vaporized to dust, and millions of people didn't perish. Both sides valued a right and responsibility that was much more important than any that had come before, the right to life, and the responsibility of the leaders of the world to protect this right from something like nuclear devastation. On the morning of October 29th, when the crisis ended, people on every side of the conflict had their lives.